This Choircast podcast is brought to you by Heretic 2 by Matthew J. DiStefano. Ready to challenge everything you thought you knew about faith? In Heretic 2, I dive into LGBTQ affirmation, rejecting divine violence, and embracing universalism in a bold post-Christian perspective. If you're done with outdated dogma and want a justice-oriented, inclusive view of spirituality, then this book is for you. Get Heretic 2 wherever books are sold, and start rethinking faith today.
Welcome to the Unbelief Podcast, your journey, actually our journey together beyond inherited beliefs to a spirituality that works for you. I'm your host, Jeremy. I'm a deep skeptic, also a pastor. We can fix that later, right? No?
Today you found another Smarty Pants episode of the Unbelief Podcast. We are talking to Karen Wiseman, the author of the book Queering the Pulpit. This is about so much more than preaching. It's about how you read the Bible through a lens that is welcoming and affirming to queer people. It's about the history of queer relationships to the church. It is absolutely fascinating. Karen is the author of Queering the Pulpit. It is a brilliant book that you should definitely be checking out. You can go anywhere that books are found. You will find Karen's book there, and Amazon or a local bookstore would be great. That would be really wonderful. But Karen, thank you so much for being here and talking about your book, Queering the Pulpit.
I am so happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation, Jeremy. It's something I'll talk about with anyone who wants to have that conversation.
Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, let's just get into it. First, I love your book. It's fantastic. But your book starts with your story. And, we don't have time for all of everybody's story, but right. I just thought, the first line was something like, I grew up in West Texas as a preacher's kid and a teacher's kid or something like that. So yeah. How do you go from growing up in West Texas as a preacher's kid to writing a book called Queering the Pulpit?
Well, as you said, I can't do the whole story, but I'll give you sort of the short. I grew up in very, very weird times. It's the late 70s, and there's, the sexual revolution, there's gay liberation, women's liberation, all that stuff going on. And I didn't hear about a lot of it because I was in this little podunk town in West Texas, and, sort of being viewed, like I was in a fishbowl as a pastor's kid, and knew early on that I was queer, that I was different. And it just was so bizarre to sort of live in that environment and know that I couldn't even tell my mom and dad that I was gay because it was scary. Yeah. I knew I was called to the ministry, but I didn't go until I was 32. Went into the ministry and was ordained in an annual conference that didn't ask the question, are you gay? Yeah. And so I was able to sort of slide in and served in United Methodist settings for, 10 years. Felt really, really called to share my love for preaching and liturgy with the church, and seminary would be the best place. So a graduate school to teach in seminary. So I went to Drew. I got a PhD in preaching and liturgical studies when my wife and I, now my wife, we'd been together for 22 years. And in 2015, we decided it's time. The gay marriage is legal. Let's get married. It was tough. We posted it at the same time on Facebook, like 8-9 months after we had gotten engaged. And within an hour and a half, my district superintendent sent me a message and said, you just self-avowed that you are a practicing homosexual. I have to report this to the bishop.
Wow.
So it was kind of quit or go to trial. I didn't want to go to trial. But that moment in 2015, it was the first time that in every part of my life, I was out.
Wow.
As a pastor, as a teacher, as a person, as a friend. And that was just 9 years ago. I'm 62. I would not wish that on anybody.
Yeah.
but it freed me. And so this book had sort of been lurking for a long time in the back of my mind. And I thought, here's the moment. I'm out. Let's do it. And it just flowed out of me. Sometimes dripping blood and sweat,
right?
And sometimes just oozing sort of love and acceptance and excitement about it. So yeah, West Texas girl goes halfway across the country and discovers that she can truly be herself and write this book that I'd been literally living for my entire life.
Wow. That's great. You know, it's odd. Yeah. You're actually the second person with a PhD in preaching that we've interviewed. The other one is was a wonderful man named Sam Parks, who helped us. Yeah. Yes, who helped us answer the question, why do preachers suck at preaching? So let's get back to your book. One of the things that I really appreciated is that you didn't jump right into talking about preaching. You have a moment where you talk about sort of the history of the relationship between queer people and the church, and you said a lot of like church jargon just a second ago. You were talking about the United Methodist Church and that church, up until just this past year, had a prohibition against queer people who were self-avowed practicing homosexuals. That language has been removed, which is wonderful. But yeah, that it was, I had friends who were brought up on charges, just like you, and it's an impossible place to be in. But I just sort of say that to clarify for anybody who's not familiar with that. But let's talk about the sort of history of the relationship between queer people and the church. Like, anti-homosexuality, that history is not as anti-homosexuality as a lot of like evangelical fundamentalist preachers would have you believe, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's one of the things that, as you said, it's part of the book where I look at the historical, cultural, biblical, and theological sort of framework of how queer people have been treated. And, there were times in ancient history that this was just a given.
Right.
The gender was fluid, the sexuality was fluid, and there were people who were kings and leaders of countries, and they had, multiple same-sex partners. And, I think throughout history, that has evolved significantly. And part of that is purity laws that, folks don't find it as pure a sexual relationship as others back in other centuries. And I think that, queer people are one of those groups that throughout history, though, it's been easy to denigrate them, right? Yeah. And so if you were a slave or you were a young man who's having sexual intercourse with another man, in some ways people culturally would say that's okay because it's part of culture, it's part of our history. Right. But at the same time, there were these huge groups of religious leaders who were more conservative, just as there are now, who began to use them as scapegoats, that they would be the enemy. Right. And so, it was that famous and often used, I just saw the movie Wicked and I love it. And part of it is if we want to get ahead, we have to name an enemy, and the enemy needs to be someone that is different from us. Right. And so racially, sexually, gender, all of these different things have been used against the community, and it's been throughout history. And so in the book, I talk about a couple of those time periods, Greek and Roman times, moving up to the Jewish traditions and into sort of our more recent past, which predominantly was very, very vitriolic. And the church didn't want you there unless you were a choir director or you played the organ. Or you were a singer, right? And so those moments would happen. But as soon as they found out you were gay, it might be hit the road, So there's just this, it's a complicated history. There's churches like the MCC and the UCC. So the Metropolitan Community Church is a gay-oriented denomination. The UCC is the one moved to the United Church of Christ, which sort of has a big tent around it. There are even people who are agnostic or atheist who are part of the UCC. And so it's just been this, who do we call the enemy in conservative or evangelical lines? And it goes back all the way in the United States to the late 1800s, early 1900s.
Yeah.
You look at folks who were arrested in the 1920s for dressing in an opposite gender. So it's just been that way for a long time historically. But the church has used it as a wedge, as a way to draw lines of who can be in and who can be out. And queer folks have too often been left out of that conversation.
So I would love, because I don't think a lot of people are as familiar with a couple of these times in history where you talked about queer relationships were more okay, there was gender fluid. Do you mind just dropping us in just for a quick deep dive on what of one of those moments in history to sort of help people say, oh, wow, that's interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah. So let's talk about the Roman Empire, right? And so the Roman Empire was a vast and varied empire. Came out of obviously ancient Rome, where the Caesars and their family would all rule. And their deal was to conquer all of these lands and to make their empire bigger and bigger and bigger. And one of the places that you see that they had this, it was just immense amounts of wealth that was going to the elite, right? And they would sponsor all kinds of games. They would sponsor, cultural events. And one of the things that the ancient empire did was they sort of took in some of the religious beliefs, because they had these huge groups of people that now all of a sudden they rule. But in ancient Rome, it was very much common for an older man to train or mentor a younger man in how to be a man, how to have sex, how to, make another person happy and pleasured, right? And so this kind of behavior was passed off usually as it's a mentorship. He's just teaching him how to do this. But you had folks who were professional, same-sex workers, and they would be used on a regular basis. So there was this sort of underground that there was some stuff that was going on that the Roman Empire didn't like because it was not that mentorship kind of reality. And then there was this above board, everybody knew, that Augustus had, 3 boys that were living with him, and he was training them how to have sex and pleasure others. And so once you sort of begin to look at the Christian religion, which is deeply rooted in Jewish tradition, it was really that clash between Jewish religious beliefs and Roman beliefs that really started making this sort of repugnant and sort of devolving into this blame and accusations and saying that it was wrong. And that was around purity. You've got to be pure. You look at that some of we'll talk, I think, a little bit later about the clobber passages, but one of them is Sodom and Gomorrah. Yeah. And, if you read Sodom and Gomorrah strictly as a historical story that has some mythology around it, you can come away feeling like, oh, that's okay. But if you really look at what's going on in the story and how it's been interpreted, both to condemn homosexuality and others to try to flip that and help people understand it's not just as it's written on the page.
Yeah. That's great. So actually, let's jump into that. You used a term that in the church world, I think is widely known, clobber passages, especially in the queer religious community. But I guess let's start up, what does that term mean? What does it refer to?
Yeah, I think that I don't know where the term came from, but I know what the term means for me, and is sort of, as you said, widely accepted. And so you think about the word itself, that combination of clobber passages. And so to clobber someone is to beat them over the head, right? To clobber them, to continue to beat them over the head. And it's related to passages that have been used religiously, culturally, historically, to condemn a particular group of folks, namely the queer community. And so it's passages both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament where there is language that specifically condemns gay folks and their sexual behavior. But if you read a little bit closer, those passages are not exactly what people think they are. So I've been a part of the church my whole life. Grew up with the pastor as a dad. He never used these clobber passages that I can remember. But I would go to a friend who was a part of sort of an evangelical church, and they were having a revival, and I would go just because all the youth were going. And, and they would stand up and they would condemn people, and it was like, you divorced folks and you gay people and da 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 da. And they would go to passages, and then they'd say Sodom and Gomorrah is an example of why all gay people ought to be killed. And it's hard because those passages, when you're in a church and they're using the text, they're using the Bible to hit you with over and over and over. After a while, you're like, I don't want to be hit anymore. That's why a lot of walk away. They're traumatized by the way the church uses its holy scriptures to hurt people. And that just makes no sense to me. We have to do better than.
So give us an example. If you don't mind, like, I'll just ask you about a couple of them. We won't go through all of them. I actually have a video on that goes step by step, but like, what, talk to me about Leviticus, right? There's a couple, like, I was at an event where Westboro Baptist Church was outside picketing with some of the most horrifying things on signs that I've ever seen.
Yeah. I've been personally picketed by them twice. And so I wear it as a badge of courage, a badge of honor. They hated what I was saying so much. They're like, I'm going to go picket her. Yeah.
And some of the things they put on their sign are these quotes from Leviticus. So can you dive into that for a second? Like, how do you deal with those passages?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we have to take into account is that every culture tries to limit any damage or behavior that's going to be bad. So, you wouldn't have a rule that says, you can't take your neighbor's sow unless people had been taking their neighbor's sow. And they wanted to stop that, right? When we say don't murder, it's because someone has murdered. And so one of the things that happens throughout the early texts of the Bible, and particularly in Leviticus, is they're trying to set up these cultural norms, right? To make these laws and say, these are the behaviors that we find, inappropriate. You can only wear this. You can only have that. Your hair has to be cut like this. You can't wear, ostentatious jewelry, all these things that are popping up. And they're all in reaction to something that someone saw that was inappropriate. And so we think that if you look at those passages in Leviticus, there's sort of two ways that we can look at them. One is the group of people who were in control at that time period who wanted to write out the laws, found same-sex behavior repugnant, and so wanted to outlaw it, wanted to just cast all those folks away. But the secondary thing is, for me, why do we pick that to obey and not the other stuff? I mean, I have on clothing that's of mixed fabrics. I ate shellfish the other day. And so part of my frustration with folks is they're picking a text out of the Bible that they can use to bash or clobber other people. So, these religious purity laws and these sort of societal norms, it was like it has become too open. We know that this stuff is happening. We need to limit that behavior. And I think it was one of those ways that they could say, Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, right? Which is the stupidest thing that Westboro Baptist Church does. And so making those laws, they were trying to cut back on things that were outside the normative behavior. And so if you have a culture that wants to limit behavior, you write laws about it. And that's what that's about. Yeah. I mean, it's strictly trying to say you can't do this. And if you do, this is your punishment.
And it's really interesting to me that, like, one of those passages, I believe it's Leviticus 19, is right in the middle of a bunch of prohibitions that people completely ignore, like eating meat with blood in it or cutting the corners of your hair. And I think that's something that also has been important for me as having like a bigger premise when I approach the ancient spiritual text of the Bible, is that like what you were saying is these are cultural norms, right? And like it's really important if we're going to engage in an ancient text to not assume that the culture that happened then is something we want to repeat now. And so that means that like it's really important for us to sort of abstract away the culture to find whatever they were doing with if there's a deeper truth there, because like marriage is culturally defined and women were property in the Bible. And I don't know any woman who wants a biblical marriage, who wants their husband to pay for them, right? And have basically a transfer of ownership ceremony, very similar to what they would do if they sold anything. But that's a biblical marriage.
Right. And, I think, some father and some bridegroom are sitting there going, I think she's worth 3 goats and a cow. And the other guy says, you know what, let's do 4 goats and, a ram. It's like, seriously, these are conversations that took place because women were property.
Mm-hmm. And, I think that the other thing is that for me, and I'd love to ask you this question, Christianity is based supposedly on the life and teachings of Jesus as the sort of primary source text. And the church has decided after it took about 1400 years to finally close everything, but that the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the sort of authoritative records of that. So question is, what did Jesus say about this?
He said nothing. He said nothing. He talked about money and equity. He talked about being kind to one another. He talked about the social and religious abuse that was happening in that era. He talked about folks who have been marginalized. And one of the things, I can't even remember where I read it, but it's when you think about the margins and folks being marginalized. So one of the things that we know is, let's say the margins are square or round or whatever. Right. Jesus would take those and fold those into the middle, right? He was constantly bringing those,
I love that imagery,
by culture in society, back into the center. And I think, when he talks about the woman caught in adultery, when he talks about the woman at the well, when he talks about, the sinners and all kinds of stuff, he's like, oh, why don't you, I'm coming to your house. Let's have a party, right? So he's talking about and exampling something that is welcoming, that is inviting, that is abundant, right? And that includes everybody. And that's the table I want. I want a table that stretches really, really far, and it has every conceivable person who's sitting there, every way that people believe, every way that people present themselves, whatever. I want that table. Yeah. What the church has said is we're gonna hang on to a couple of old laws and a couple of old customs to abuse people. And we become sort of this club that's really not about following Jesus. It's about making sure that our beliefs get taken care of and that we know what our truth is. And it just makes me crazy because, if it's such a big issue, why does Jesus never talk about it?
Right.
He talks about marriage. He talks about divorce. He talks about, income inequality and all these other things. He said nothing as far as we know, right? So the authors, those 4 authors, they told the story from their perspective and the way that they wanted to tell it. And I look at people today. We were talking about this before the interview started, that the best way to be a Christian is just be a Christian and not be a jerk to others. And I think sometimes some Christians get off on being a jerk. Just because it fits their narrative, it fits their worldview, which is really sad for me. I mean, it makes me sad.
Yeah, it is sad because it's such a beautiful approach to life that Jesus exemplifies, right?
Yeah.
And it's always sad for me when I see people taking that text and twisting it to do what I would consider as the opposite. Jesus, like you said, I love that image of folding the margins into the middle. Jesus is always, including more people, and to use his words and this movement that sort of flowed out of that to narrow it, to include less people. I don't know. It seems the exact opposite. So, okay, the book is called Queering the Pulpit, right?
Yeah.
And the subtitle is A Sexagetical Approach to Preaching and Inclusive Word. So, for those people who are not as schooled in jargon of the sort of graduate level talk about preaching, that you are sort of playing on another word that is really commonly used called exegetical or exegesis. So what is exegesis?
So when you study to become a pastor, as you said, or to work with biblical texts, is you learn a technique that's called exegesis, which basically means to study the word, right? It's to take a text and to study what words are used, to study what phrases, what images, to look at what historically people believed about that passage. It is to, maybe even look at the ancient Greek or Aramaic or whatever original translations. And it really is to study, with biblical scholarship. There are all kinds of scholars who've written books, and there's all kinds of series of interpretive books. And all of that is to sit down for a preacher to say, all right, this is what I think is going on biblically. This is what I think is going on, historically, culturally, in that time period, in that moment. And it's a process that is similar sort of across the board, but there's a different intent behind it, right? And so if you're a conservative evangelical, you're going to read those kind of translations or interpretations of those texts. If you're more progressive, you're also going to, you're going to go read more progressive sort of authors. Where it came for me is exegesis asks us questions. What's going on? Who's this written to? Why is it written at that time period? Those kind of questions. And when I was thinking about this book, I kept thinking, this book is for preachers, but it's also for everybody who sits in a pew or used to sit in a pew or might sit in a pew at some point. And so I started thinking about what are different questions that I want to ask. And it was stuff like, what's going on in this congregation about sexuality? What's happening in the larger society? What's happening with you? And there's this whole series of questions that I sort of tack on top of the process of exegesis. And I could not figure out what to call it because I wanted it to be similar in the process, but I also wanted it to have its own sort of reality. And I was talking with my wife, and I kept saying, I want to come up with, I've got the framework, I think, but I don't know what to call it. And she said, well, you don't want to just call it exegetical. And I said, no, because it's about sex and gender and that kind of stuff. I said, maybe sexegesis. And both of our eyes went wide. And it was like, that's the word.
That's it.
If anyone ever came up with that word before, I have never found that, but it is my word. And it is sexagetical process or sexegesis, to really look at a text and go, how has this been used in the past? How do we understand how gay people, queer people might hear this? How do we understand how a trans person might hear this particular passage? And, I say in the book several times, if this book saves one kid who's trans, who hears a word in the prayer or in the sermon that says, transphobia is not okay. Homophobia is not okay. And that we need to take care of our siblings. I mean, the simple thing of doing a prayer, and instead of saying for our sisters and brothers, to say for our siblings, is a simple thing, but it sends a message, right? And so for me, that sexagetical piece it is very personal, but it is also, it requires the person who's crafting this sermon to go deeper into what they've already seen and to really look at how would this passage be heard by queer folks? Because that question has not been asked before, not in any processes that I've seen. So it's a framework on top of the exegetical process. But at the same time, I think that people who are not pastors, who are not preachers, they can read through this and go, "Oh man, I would love it if my pastor did X, did one of these things and was able to say this passage has been used to hurt gay people." And we need to acknowledge that, and we need to acknowledge that not everybody hears it the same way. So really, it's the way to put sex and gender and sexuality on top of that already established framework, and I think it's a powerful process. If you do it, you're going to preach differently, because you may not know how many people are sitting there in your congregation or sitting beside one of your folks here at whatever sort of spiritual retreat that's going on, or some other way that people are expressing their spirituality. You may not know that the person next to you is trans and has been thinking about committing suicide. And, and so I want us to be very aware of what's happening in our pulpits that we may know about and those things that we may not know about.
No, that's brilliant. So can you just give me a bullet point, just like a really rough outline of what are the questions that people, and because I think, yes, this is great for pastors, but I think that the average person who reads the Bible, they are interested either in the Bible as their own spiritual text or just as the Bible in general. I think this is a helpful approach for them, even if they're not preachers. So could you just give us the bullet point? Like, what are the questions that you're saying, like, can be helpful to ask when you read a passage of scripture from the Bible?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, the first question I want people to look at is why was this particular text written? Who wrote it? And what was their intent, right? What was their purpose in writing this? And, you have all different kinds of perspectives and all different kinds of understanding. I mean, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John don't even agree on how things happen, right? But when you look at a text and, we're almost at Christmas. Can I talk about the birth narrative?
Yeah, let's do this as a sort of experiment with the birth narrative.
Yeah. So when we think about the birth narrative, and I'm just going to assume that folks sort of know the rough outline, but let me give you a quickie. Is that Mary is visited by an angel. She's impregnated with the Christ child. Joseph wants to divorce her, but an angel comes to him and says, "No, you need to be the father, and Jesus is going to be his name." And so this couple who has, in all intents and purposes, what we understand, has never had sexual intercourse in any way, that she is impregnated as a virgin, all right? That they have to travel a long distance to go be a part of a census. And we believe from the Christmas pageants that happen, is that everything happened in the same way. There's sort of gospel puree, right? It's just a little bit of Luke, a little bit of Mark, a little bit of Matthew. And so they show up. There's no room at the inn. The innkeeper says they go to this to the outhouse, a barn, and he's given birth. The shepherds come and proclaim and worship him, and then the three kings come, and then there's the great escape. That's just the quickie. Now, let's look at that text as a sexagetical approach. So one, I want to look at the virgin birth, right?
Right.
All right. So God has come to her as an angel and has impregnated her. And so what I first think about is, for the queer community, what does having children mean? What is the intentionality to make that happen, right? And so there's a very complicated process for a lot of gay folks and for folks who are struggling in other ways to have a child. And so what does that say to a community if I simply say this is the only way that birth is sacred? What if, so for me, birth is sacred, but it's not the way my wife and I have a child. We adopted him. There are other gay couples who have IVF. They have surrogates. And so when I think about that birth narrative, I have to put on the lens of what this says to queer folks. Does it give them a way into that story, or does it take them out of that story? Yeah. And too often simply saying, the virgin birth is the greatest thing that's ever happened, is to say to queer folks, we know you're having a hard time having a kid, but you can't have this happen to you. Joseph finding out and saying, I'm going to divorce her, is another example of a man saying that the woman's worth is lost because she's pregnant. And we have a lot of folks in the queer community who have been told, you're worthless. You're not, you're not valid. You're not valued. You're not important. And so we're going to cast you off. So those two sort of kind of images interplay. And if I'm reading from a queer lens, I will think about what it means for a father, a stepfather, to say to, going to be a stepfather, to say to his wife, I don't want to have anything to do with you. There are so many queer folk who get told from their parents, you're no good to me because of X, Y, and Z, just simply because you're gay. So looking at that, I think that's very important to think about in the birth narrative. Then you go and, we can talk about there's no innkeeper in the text. We've sort of created that. And to think about who the first people are to come to see Jesus. It is a stuffy, smelly, out of the cultural norm, marginalized community that are shepherds. And the angel comes to them and says, hey, go see this new birth, this new baby. Again, looking at that from a queer lens, who are the people who would be so marginalized that God would say, I want that first declaration that he's mine to come from a group that is totally unworthy of being in our synagogues, that is totally unworthy of being in our community because they're so dirty, so, it's menial labor. And so looking at that with a queer lens, it means I have to ask different questions. Yeah. And if I'm asking different questions, then when I'm talking about it, I say, this is an amazing birth story, but it's not how everybody, gets a child. And it's not, the way everybody parents. And so looking at that from the sexegetical approach, you get some really different, answers to some of the things that the queer community might find problematic. Does that help?
Yeah, no, that's helpful. And so then once you're asking that, what do you do with those answers that you get?
Well, what I hope is that becomes a part of your sermon, right? That becomes a part. Well, and this book can also be used for a book study. It could inspire a congregation to have a forum series where they have Sunday school or they have study or they talk through these things. But what I want to happen is that we become so aware of the people who would hear this badly that people would not hear this as what the church says good news, right? And that would mean when I talk about the virgin birth, I say stuff like, every time that I hear this story around Christmas, I wonder about all those folks who have spent countless hours praying for a child, who have spent, literally tens of thousands of dollars to try to get pregnant, for families that could never have children naturally and chose adoption or, to have a foster child. And I just want you all to hear that parenthood looks different for different people. So I would put that in a way that hopefully speaks to folks, straight folks who had trouble getting pregnant, and just hear that phrase, that understanding a little differently. That's what I would hope, and that people would use these questions. Who does it hurt, right? Who does it hurt if I tell a story in that particular way? Who does it help? and who gets marginalized. And there's a lot of texts that we love to marginalize people with.
Right.
I love the story of the Good Samaritan. Biblical story. This guy is robbed on a road, is beaten and bloodied, and is cast out on the side of the road. Two religious leaders walk by separately, and they don't stop to help him.
Right.
A Samaritan comes along who Jews were constantly at battle with. I mean, it was this was two communities that hated each other. Good Samaritan comes by and helps the guy, takes him to an inn, pays the innkeeper to take care of him. So in the Christian church, there is typically two ways of preaching that sermon. One, you think about your own community, and you go, oh gosh, we've done badly. We're the people walking by and leaving this guy on the side of the road. And so they do the guilt sermon or the shame sermon, or they do the sermon that says, this is what we ought to be doing, right? But we don't. And so let's feel shame for not doing that. There's the other sermon that comes out of that by saying, oh yeah, we're doing a lot. We're the Good Samaritan. Yeah. And so they praise their community. But what happens if the sermon instead is from the perspective of the guy on the side of the road?
Right. Yeah.
What if we told that story from his or her perspective, right? What if we tell that as a trans man? What if we tell that story as a black lesbian who's living in a commune? It doesn't matter. But if we think about marginalized communities and we go, how would they see the religious leaders walking by? And this one guy stops, and he's the bitter enemy in this area, and he's the one who takes care of folks. And I just think that there are so many passages out there that could be flipped, could be talked differently. It's sort of a new approach or a new understanding if we look at it from a different perspective.
Yeah. And, what I appreciate is that, when you take this exegetical approach, even as an individual, right? Not somebody who's gone to graduate school, not somebody who's a pastor. If you're reading the Bible and you're asking this question, like, what does this mean for queer people, right? How does this feel from that perspective? I think that, if it's somebody who's, cisgender, who's sexual person, reading that, I think a lot of them will come up maybe with blanks or not be sure. And, but I think what that feels like to me is an opportunity to have a conversation with the queer people in your life. And so, I wonder, Karen, if that's, so let's talk about the birth narrative. Let's go back to the Christmas story, as people call it. And, you said that when you ask that, what does, a birth mean for a queer person? And it means a lot of difficulty. So just sort of put yourself in those people, in a just average person, who's asking that question, who is not part of the queer community. How would you tell them to, help themselves fill in the blank by talking to one of their queer friends? Like how can you approach this kind of a conversation about an ancient text and try to get other viewpoints from a marginalized group, without being, saying the wrong thing, being rude, whatever? How would you sort of advise them to approach that conversation?
Well, the first thing I think is to not be afraid to be wrong. Often we go in these conversations and we're not listening to the person asking the question. In our mind, we're already forming our response because we really don't care about what the other person thinks or believes. We just want to be able to put our perspective on the table as the perspective. So that's really big, is walking into conversations knowing that you might be wrong about something, or you might be wrong in the language that you use, right? We have a couple of trans students who are here at our seminary, and there are moments when someone will they get their pronoun wrong. And what I have learned, and what I try to teach, and what our queer and trans students try to say is, if you make a mistake, that's okay if you can say, oh, did I use the wrong pronoun? Or to receive, I appreciate that, but my pronoun is she or they.
Right.
And to be open to being wrong, to be open to changing your perspective on something, but also to walk into it with grace. And grace is a word that we use a lot in the church. And it's that free gift from God that says you're forgiven, you're loved, you're special, you're important, you're a beloved. And I think that a lot of these conversations don't start with grace or respect for the other person. So, if I'm a straight person who wants to enter into a conversation about sexuality or queer studies or whatever, or the virgin birth or anything, I want to go in and say, I've heard you say something in the past about the virgin birth. I heard you say something after church today. Could we talk about that? That really felt hurtful for me. And to have those kinds of questions, it's to say, what did you mean by that? Right? If somebody says something, what did you mean by that? What was the purpose behind that? And it happens to queer folks all the time. They'll be going about their lives and nothing is, everything's great. And they'll encounter some bigot, some person that doesn't respect them. And so part of it is counting the cost. Do I need to be in this conversation? Do I need to educate this person? Because sometimes you're just like, you know what? I'm exiting this conversation. You, in your perspective, you keep it and I'm walking away.
Right.
But we can't do that with everybody. I mean, we're coming up, we've had Thanksgiving, we're coming up on Christmas and Hanukkah and all different religious traditions. Some of them are religious traditions. Some of them are traditions outside of the religious spectrum that people celebrate during this time of the year. And there's a lot of interaction with family. And we can disagree on a whole lot of subjects, but we still come together as family. And I think it's really important to have your boundaries up. I know what I'm willing to have a conversation about and what I'm not. And so if the conversation comes up, whatever the topic, whether it's religion or around sexuality or gender, it's around, recent elections, it doesn't matter. I have boundaries about what I'm willing to be in a conversation about, because I don't need to use up my energy. I don't need to use up my being, my presence in a conversation that doesn't serve anyone well. The thing is,
go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry. No, I was just saying the thing is going into these conversations with an open heart and an open mind and an open ear. So you're willing to hear it. If someone asks you questions, to say, I don't think you want the answer that I could potentially give you. So there's, just a lot of scenarios, but my biggest thing is be willing to be wrong, be willing to be vulnerable, be willing to listen and be present in the conversation, and be willing to say, nope, that's beyond what my capacity is right now. I just don't need to talk about that. I think that's important.
Yeah, I was recently talking to one of my queer friends about this birth narrative, and they said something beautiful. One of the questions I like to ask people is, when they're reading a text, where do they find themselves in that? Like, where do they identify? And this person said that they really identified with Joseph because a lot of queer people's families are very different. They're like you mentioned, that if it's talking about having your own children, raising your own children, that's different. A lot of people have been let go by their family and disowned, or their family's been so horrible that they've let go. And they were talking about how Joseph is not the biological father of that child. and how they really identify with that because they have a child through adoption, not biological, but also they have people that they consider family that are also not biologically related to them, but they really count as their immediate family because their actual biological family is not in their life right now.
Right.
So, go ahead.
I just find that so tragic, you know. And you know, in my own life, I knew very young that I was different. Knew in late elementary, junior high that I was attracted to girls. Didn't know how to do that. Didn't come out until I was 19. Took years before I came out to my family. And lots of struggles, decades of not really having a relationship with my dad. And he died this summer, and we got to have a moment before he died when I said, Dad, I want you to know that I forgive you.
Wow.
I know that the ways that I disappointed you, the ways that I was not what you expected, the ways that maybe I made loving me harder. I forgive you, and I hope you'll forgive me. And, you know, he has Alzheimer's. I have no idea what he heard or not. He looked at me and he said, "Hey, you look just like your dad." And I said, "Yeah, you're my dad." And he said, "Yeah, and we're both troublemakers." And I'm like, you know, I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
But to see some of my friends, my queer friends, who have been just abused by their families, and to think that a lot of that has been perpetuated in the name of a cultural norm that we sort of base on a biblical text that has been proven in many different ways to not be about what we think it's about, and to hate your kid, you know, to tell your kid, don't come at Christmas. We don't want you here. That just breaks my heart. But I think chosen family or family, you know, that you've brought into your life is a powerful thing. And helps so much when you don't have anybody else that's sort of on your side and knows who you are. I think I interrupted to share that, but
no, that's great. I just appreciate this. I appreciate this book, Queering the Pulpit. This idea of what you have termed a sexagetical approach to preaching an inclusive word. I feel like if people want to get this, obviously, everywhere you can find books, you should give this to your pastor. But I feel like it's worth reading yourself because there's not only is it sort of teaching a different way of reading the Bible, but there's actually a lot of great content before you get to how you read the Bible in this way. And I think I just really appreciated the whole thing top to bottom, and for you being on the podcast with us. So we have this community called Not Church where people who have all kinds of different beliefs are there for each other. We call it Not Church because somebody said that it's like church. People are there for each other in hard times. People are exploring spirituality and religion and processing their own religious trauma. And nobody is telling you you're going to hell for believing the wrong thing. And if you'd like to be part of that community, you just go to patreon.com/skepticpastor. You pay $3 and you'll be invited to the Discord. We charge $3 because we're not going to ask you to give 10% of your income. You pay for what you get. So if it works for you, great. If it stops working for you, just stop paying. And if you want some cool merch, newmancommunity.com/store. And if wherever you're finding this podcast, if you can give us all the stars, say something nice about us, it really does help.
That's it. That's the podcast. Shout out to the Choir Network, to Patheos, to Matthew and Keith, who make everything happen. Now, get out of here. Go do something to make the world a better place. Okay? We'll see you next time.